Welcome back to Apocalypse here. The past couple videos that I've made on a couple of different things to do with the apocalyptic Paul, in brief, have gotten good responses, so I figured I'd continue on this sort of in brief series. So I'm making a playlist of these videos, and the playlist is called In Brief, all of which are going to be related to Pauline theology, stuff like that. So you can go there for all of those in one place. So this is going to be another In Brief video. So today for this video, I'm going to be talking about the new perspective on Judaism. And some of you have probably heard of the new perspective on Paul, which is often conflated with the new perspective on Judaism in certain ways. And this isn't quite right. So in this video, I'm going to give a brief summary of the new perspective on Judaism, and then for the next In Brief video, how the new perspective on Paul and scholars within that sort of camp use the insights from the new perspective on Judaism and apply them to the Pauline data. So in 1977, a scholar called E.P. Sanders wrote what is now a very famous book called Paul and Palestinian Judaism. And in it, he set up an angle of approach that challenged the conventional construal of Paul in relation to Jews and Judaism. The conventional construal being that Jews were basically all legalists who were trying to earn their way to salvation by doing the law, and that the Christian gospel is then premised on the self-evident collapse of Judaism. So Sanders' main focus in his work was on the description of Jews in Paul's day as they described themselves in various Jewish sources preserved from around the New Testament period. Now, Sanders judged all of these works, with a couple of exceptions. We're talking about the same basic story of God's relationship with Jews. And it turns out it wasn't actually a legalistic story of earning one's way to heaven or whatever through works prescribed by the Torah or law. Instead, it was a story that Sanders dubbed covenantal nomism. Covenantal here refers to the idea that God initiates or elects and sustains an irrevocable relationship with God's people. And nomism, nomos being the Greek word often translated as law in Paul. So nomism refers to God's expectations of God's people given in the Torah within precisely that secure covenantal arrangement. Sanders found that Jews are not relating to God through the Torah by trying to merit their way into God's heart. Rather, the Torah guides their faithful response to God's loving and covenantal commitment to them. So it's not, if you follow the Torah, then you'll be in God's covenant, but because God has initiated a covenant with you, there are expectations given in the Torah for how you are to respond appropriately to that arrangement. So this is how Sanders himself summarizes his position. Quote, "The pattern or structure of covenantal nomism is this: 1, God has chosen Israel, and 2, given the law. The law implies both 3, God's promise to maintain the election, and 4, the requirements to obey. 5, God rewards obedience and punishes transgression. 6, the law provides means for atonement, and atonement's results in 7, maintenance or reestablishment of the covenantal relationship. 8, all those who are maintained in the covenant by obedience, atonement, and God's mercy belong to the group which will be saved. An important interpretation of the first and last points is that election and ultimately salvation are considered to be by God's mercy rather than human achievement." End quote. So it's just a totally different logic than the sort of conventional approach to Judaism. And one that is more accurate to the way that Jews in Paul's day actually operated. Responses to Sanders' new perspective on Judaism have pointed out the rather monolithic nature of his proposal, that basically all Jews were covenantal nomis, and that there really isn't a trace of legalism at all in anything. But it is highly unlikely, given the complexities of history, that this depiction would be sustainable, however crucial Sanders' basic insights were, which they are. However, it does make sense, given Sanders' learned proposal, to affirm that a significant proportion of Jews in Paul's day were covenantal nomis, in the way that Sanders laid it out. And this story of God's covenantal commitment and the Jews' in response to that interwove with various other key practices, things like prayer, almsgiving, support for the temple, dietary and calendar observances, etc. So these powerful sociological practices then fostered, in turn, a recognizable people. So Sanders' thesis had a really seismic impact on the study of Paul, even though he was not the first one to point out the unfairness of a legalistic characterization of Jews. So an example would be Richard Longnecker's Paul, Apostle of Liberty, which was actually published 13 years before Sanders' book, and W.D. Davies before that. So the question that arises for the interpretation of Paul's actual text is, what is Paul doing when he seems to be describing Jews in legalistic terms, especially in Galatians, Philippians, and Romans? What did he really think was going on in relation to the law or the Torah? Some important scholars went on to try to answer these questions by advancing a new perspective on Paul, in response to Sanders' articulation of a new perspective on Judaism. And their position has become very widely known, sometimes to the point that it has dominated the discussion. So in the next video, we're going to talk about the new perspective and how they're responding to Sanders' really important concerns and bringing them into the Pauline data in a particular way. And we'll talk a little bit about how successful that has been. If you have any questions about this video, please leave that in the comments section. Like the video. If you're not subscribed to the channel, it'd be great if you could do that. With that, this has been Apocalypse Here, Christianity You Can Live With.